You are listening to the e-flux podcast.
My name is Hallie Ayers. I'm assistant director here at e-flux, and I also had the privilege of editing the 2021 edition of the Cosmic Bulletin, which is an online publication influenced by the philosophy of Russian cosmism and its historical and contemporary manifestations. And so today I am joined by Miriam Hillawi Abraham and Nasra Abdullahi, who contributed a text to this issue of the bulletin. And I'm really excited to speak with them today a little bit about their text and the ideas that they're working with. And I'll just introduce both of them briefly here. And the Cosmic Bulletin is hosted on the Institute of the Cosmos, which is an online platform that can be found on cosmos.art. But anyway, without further ado, Miriam Hillawi Abraham is a multidisciplinary designer from Addis Ababa, Ethiopia. With a background in architecture, she works with digital media and spatial design to interrogate themes of equitable futurism and intersectionality. She holds an MFA in interaction design from the California College of the Arts and a Bachelor of Architecture from the Glasgow School of Art. She is a CCA-Mellon researcher for the Digital Now Multidisciplinary Project, a 2020 fellow of Gray Area's Zachary Watson Education Fund, and a Graham Foundation 2020 grantee. And Nasra Abdullahi is a designer, writer, and editor based in London. She is currently a junior writer at Wallpaper magazine, the 2021 guest editor of the Avery Review, and a member of the second cohort of new architecture writers. A student at the Bartlett School of Architecture, she is interested in ways we can seek equitable futures through material cultures away from projected architectural and urban desires. Seeking a multiplicity in spatial practice, she is interested in what modern architectural technology can look like when innovated and reappropriated through and in relation with various knowledge systems. Currently, her work is centered around exploring the possibilities of using analytical tools from Black and Indigenous radical traditions to inform us about design and technological practice. So, Miriam and Nasra, thank you so much for joining me this morning, and super excited to have you. Perhaps we'll just start off if you wanted to give a little intro into the text you wrote for the bulletin, which is called the Afro-Cosmologist Treatise on the Astrolabe, and then a little bit about the short story that accompanies it. So, yeah.
Thank you, Hallie, for introducing us. In the Afro-Cosmologist Treatise on the Astrolabe that we wrote for the Cosmic Bulletin 2021, we expand on the cosmological underpinnings of our work that emerges from our practice of hijacking technologies and extending definitions of history from discrete events to tailgating timelines and projecting myths onto planes of unproof. And the way that this project started is through a short story titled The Horn of Africa Grounds for Unproof, which is set in Djibouti, mainly Djibouti's capital, Djibouti City, which is one of the countries. Djibouti is one of the countries on the Horn of Africa. And it's a story where our main character, Samira, ventures into La Place Menelik, an old relic of the French colonial past in present-day Djibouti City. This site is not unliving. It is both the setting and the narrator of the tale. Samira unwittingly triggers a glitch in the time-space continuum where she comes to possession of a family heirloom, an ancient navigational device called an Astrolabe. This device, however, is charged with a mysterious power and takes Samira, our time traveler, on a journey through time where she's plunged into historically shifting events and timelines on the Horn of Africa, eventually arriving in the speculated future of millions of years ahead, when a dramatic tectonic event ruptures the continent, setting our characters adrift into a newly formed island.
Thank you so much. So I wanted to start off the conversation just by asking this question about genre. So what prompted you to lean toward fiction, and especially historical fiction, as the vehicle for this narrative that unfolds in the short story?
So this project was born from a friendship that we formed and continued to grow from a distance. And as we still have yet to meet in person, believe it or not, we strive to understand one another across a largely digital space. So when we're both exploring like our shared cultural origins and the Horn of Africa, and how our heritage and projected futures, be they diasporic or on the ground, are ever shifting and unstable realities, we find ourselves continually like returning to these muddled timelines and grappling with these overwhelmingly complex political systems, and of course the unknowability for a collective future. So we found that anchoring ourselves to a locality became increasingly important as we drifted further into the imaginary. So territory became something that is both real and tangible, but also an active terrain that we use as a test bed for our storytelling.
So using narrative fiction became this exercise which allowed us to sort of detach and at times escape from the hopelessness of global political systems. Miriam and I actually started to collaborate on our short story in 2020, towards the end of 2020, and I can imagine for a lot of our listeners as well, that was a year, sort of this reset year. And often with a lot of us were asking ourselves questions about what everything essentially means. And at times, global political systems can feel colossal in the ways in which they take away our abilities to imagine an otherwise, particularly as African people. So our world building then is an exercise in our imagination. And anybody who's a storyteller knows that imagination is work. It takes so much effort and love to want to build an otherwise that is rooted in liberation and does not work only at the expense of others. So as we imagine beyond the possible, our narrative fiction and myth-making functions as a kind of retroactive sci-fi, and we use these to demystify complexities, working with the known world and our emerging realities. And the purpose behind this collaboration was born from our want of belonging in our cultural past, origins, and presence, and to imagine desirable futures. So it creates an interesting dynamic where we can explore our experiences, our imagination, and our imaginations in relation to this bridge between the Afro-diasporic and the continental.
Sweet. And then also with the short story as well, what does it mean to craft a narrative from the point of view of a place or a site? And what was this process like in terms of learning to think geologically, architecturally, material, geographically? And what's this methodology that you're using for imbuing architecture with sentience?
Yeah, so when building our short story, we personified the land and treated the land as a sentient being capable of feeling, of having desire and memory. And we started this by zooming out geographically and geologically, by asking ourselves, what is the view of the present from the perspective or the position of the earth itself? And one thing that is happening constantly within our region is the Great Rift Valley in the Horn of Africa and in the East African Rift. So the East African Rift is an active continental rift system, which is made up of a series of rift basins that meet the Red Sea and the Gulf of Aden in the north before turning inland into the Ethiopian highlands and further down to Mozambique. So the Afar Triple Junction, which is the Afro-Arabian rift system, is located within these divergent plate boundaries of the Nubian, Somali, and Arabian plates at the northernmost point of the Eastern Rift Valley, the Eastern Rift. So geologists actually speculate that within 10 million years or so, the Red Sea will breach this area surrounding that Afar Depression and ultimately submerge the whole length of the East African Rift, creating this sort of island or creating a new ocean basin, a new island mass consisting of eastern Ethiopia, Djibouti, and parts of Southeast Africa. So this will literally sever the Horn of Africa from the rest of the continent and set it adrift.
So our narrative then is stationary time travel, where we stumble through a series of events, histories, and sudden endings in place from a fixed point. However, even the Earth itself is far from still, and the land itself is not one continuous mass, but a series of broken pieces moving against and away from one another. So rather than us imbuing the Earth with sentience, we recognize the land as already being alive and active, and we're merely giving it a voice to express what it continues to witness and cause. And through this narrative, we have entangled the definitions of land, architecture, and geology. Our narrator is not merely the building plus Menelik and Djibouti city, nor are they just the plot of land it was constructed on. But instead of fragment of the earth with unclear boundaries, it ends where another begins. And it undergoes, as our main character, it undergoes redefinition, undoing, and destruction. And to sort of understand this, I think I'll just give a very quick contextual overview of the Horn of Africa and what we mean by the Horn of Africa. So the Horn of Africa is the eastern part of Africa that kind of is the easternmost extension that kind of sticks out of Africa. That's why it's called the Horn, and it consists of Eritrea, Djibouti, Ethiopia, and Somalia. It's the easternmost extension of Africa where the Red Sea, the Gulf of Aden, and the Indian Ocean converge. Today, unfortunately, the region is characterized by repressive regimes, continuous state and non-state insurgencies, vulnerability to unchecked violence, resulting in large-scale internal and external displacements and trans-border conflicts. A lot of local histories also continue to be points of contention in the region, manifesting in deep contemporary fissures along ethnic lines and divergent ideologies. We're seeing questions around the validity of Western-style nation building when enforced upon populations who possess their own conceptions of nationhood, communities, identity, and governance. So the state protocols continue to redraw and regulate territories, so controlling the mobility and contact between various urban, nomadic, and agrarian peoples who are widely dispersed across borders in the region. So as a region, it seems to be embroiled in perpetual conflict, whose histories are at risk of erasure and places that are always associated with being, quote, failed states. So we're asking ourselves, what does this imply for those who are living in these countries? What does this do to the work of imagining an otherwise that is free from war and violence?
And so you've chosen to structure the short story around the protagonist of Samira, who inherits the Astrolabe, but there's also the figure of Leo Africanus, and he's also one of these time-traveling characters within the story. And so I wanted to ask how you arrived at this figure, and how does what exists and what's omitted in his own historical record advance your sort of nomadic conception of space?
So we stumbled across Leo Africanus during our own temporal roamings through history. So while exploring antiquity, we found that authors of these histories were in themselves really relevant, especially those who were typically non-Western, local and nomadic, and describing the continent. Often authors of these histories have already eroded in character over time, but their accounts remain relevant to modern historians and scholars. So many, in fact, may have been misnamed, misattributed, or altogether fabricated as characters. Leo Africanus was particularly interesting to us as his autobiographical traveler's account, transcribed in Italian into a series of 9 books called Description of Africa, published in 1526, was the first European publication with detailed descriptions of North Africa and West Central Africa. So the books themselves describe the rivers, mountains, and cities of the African kingdoms along the Nile and in the Maghreb. It became one of the most authoritative sources about Islam and African geography for European travelers and politicians from the 16th to the 19th century. So his firsthand traveler's account was not only a really reliable account for travelers at the time, but it was also enriched with fantastical and colorful glimpses into his mysterious life, built from memories or stories imagined or borrowed from other travelers, and elevating him to an almost mythical figure among travelers of that era and historians today. So while he's widely referred to as Leo Africanus, he was born Al-Hassan ibn Muhammad al-Wazn al-Fasi, and he was a 16th century Andalusi geographer and diplomat, who was born in Granada around the time of the Spanish Inquisition, when many Amazigh people and followers of Jewish and Muslim faiths were ejected or forced to flee from Granada at the time. And Leo's family came to settle in Fez, hence his name Al-Fasi, which means of Fez, in Morocco, where he went on to study at one of the oldest, or what's known as the oldest running university in the world, which is the Al-Qarawiyyin University. So soon Leo became a trusted envoy of the Sultan of Fez. This is all according to his journal, of course, which may not be true, again, unconfirmed. as it is like one piece of documentation of this history. And he began his travels through North Africa and perhaps beyond that. Although the date of Leo's abduction is not certain, it is said that he was captured by Spanish corsairs while traveling either from Crete or along the Tunisian coast. And this was a really common occurrence at the time, and those who suffered this fate were often sold into slavery or sent to Christian galleys in Europe. However, perhaps due to his notable talents and the peculiar maps and notes that he had in his possession, Leo was able to escape this fate and was instead presented to the Pope Leo X, Giovanni di Lorenzo di Medici, in Rome. And of course, his patron not only was perhaps being charitable, but also had his own political agenda, where he wished to kind of investigate into the territorial politics of North Africa at the time. And perhaps Leo himself bartered for his own life and asked for a position at the papacy with his unique knowledge and expertise. But he was inevitably freed and offered a pension by Leo X. And after agreeing to convert to Christianity, which at the time was a common imposition on North African captives, Leo continued working there in Rome for most of his life, according to his journals. And the whereabouts of his final years is very unclear and unknown. So the last 30 years between the publication of the description of Africa and the date of his death are sort of shrouded in mystery. And this kind of places Leo at the time of his death potentially in North Africa, where he settled in Tunis, or maybe he returned to second home in Morocco, unable to return to Granada. So through this narrative, Leo was unmade again and again and refashioned and continually negotiated his destiny by occupying many selves and that dwelled in different worlds or were able to dwell in these different worlds and survive in them, while also holding onto a secret fragment of his own identity through his memory. And upon this shifting terrain, our human character, or our agent, is traveled by this errant time traveler, the traveler being Leo Africanus, who we plucked from the course of history and placed into the Horn of African landscape, which oscillates between an era of pre-territorial settlement and an epoch succeeding man's dominion over Earth.
So in a way, we're filling in these gaps of knowledge and speculating and taking advantage of the already existing cartographic protocols of, dividing the sedentary from the nomadic. And we see that in a world where the mapped alone is assumed to exist, when you don't fit into the protocols of the nation state, you are for the most part strategically rendered invisible. The map and documented and preserved history, often that is written, acts as an authority in legitimizing statehood. So nomadic being, often peripheral to the outlines of statehood, isn't really counted. So for early nomadic communities, daily life meant confronting extreme environmental conditions. And to paraphrase Pierre-Aurélie Vittorio here, the ritual offered a way to, crystallize necessary routines against something, the chronic unpredictability of existence. So as nomads don't necessarily observe political borders. Their spatiality and territoriality is very distinct properties, where the need for territory is climate sensitive and is defined in this sort of periodic and rhythmic way. And whilst we're theoretically setting our scope and working with abstractions, our aim is to weave a relational knowledge base born from the groundworks of local African epistemologies and from the Horn of Africa in particular. This specificity is paramount to the diversification of perspectives, which is multiple in imagination and thought. Not only does it sustain the integrity and uniqueness of the site, but it also allows us to innovate further. And this distinction is, I would say, necessary in order to embark on a diverse African cosmology that is simultaneously continental, local, technological, and spiritual. Its ontology then represents the knowledge exchange and material cultures across multiple sedentary and nomadic communities from regions such as North Africa, the Sahel, and the Horn of Africa. And by following the device as it passes through various contexts and formal iterations, mutations, evolutions, we are retracing mapped and unmapped diasporic roamings, a deliberate destabilization of classical cartography becomes a method of experimental mark-making for a new cosmological framework. This is intentional, and it's an intentional misinterpretation of readings, which allows us to endow the astrolabe with new meanings as we seek to gain mastery over our futures. So we ask ourselves, what temporal and cosmological complications may arise from projecting and moving strategic trade routes indigenous to the Horn of Africa onto a navigational device from antiquity?
And then thinking about deep time in a geological sense, how does the concept of deep time impact your thinking with cosmological theory, and especially with objects like the Astrolabe that features heavily in the short story and in the text for the bulletin?
So for us, by bringing these human histories and lore into direct contact with the vastness of deep time, these experiences are met with this intense compression, then widened into this expansion. So in our cosmology, time is allowed elasticity and malleability, widening the creases between these absolutes and disparate truths that we're very used to in our present day. And we open up these portals in between them. Unlike the fleeting lives of its human inhabitants, this earth has lived through many epochs, endured great pains, continues to clutch memories and longing. The ongoing geological time clock is far beyond our scale of comprehension, and for the most part goes unnoticed by us. Nonetheless, it persists with a creeping threat of inevitable entropy. And as these plates that we mentioned within the East Valley Rift continue to diverge at a rate of specifically 6 to 7 millimeters a year along the tectonic boundary of a triple junction, this vastness of the geological space-time is felt as this sort of unrelenting progress of deep time. And we're drawing it against our efforts to prevent or withstand catastrophes as humans within the Horn's immediate geopolitical tensions and also environmental tensions as well, which creates a land element with a multi-scalar dimension. So this narrative element where we can experience the story through several scales or several layers. And it's disinclined to the territorial definitions, and it's bound to change. So we use this geological activity of the rift as a rifting that is suffered by our narrator, the sentient Earth, who has unwillingly undergone this astronomical transformation in the past and is now subject to relive it, and to also live through the whims of these smaller, minute organisms like humans that have such a large impact and roam across its surface, with its future being fated to be undone yet again. So by introducing our temporal glitch, we collapse these timelines from the immeasurably large to the immediate and sudden, fusing the human with the earth and creating this sense of joint motion between the human and the geological, intimating our relationship to be more direct and to also promise a joint demise, a joint death that's both human and planetary.
And by misaligning this this geological time clock with the human one, our characters are able to fall into the faults between these uneven durations. A sudden slippage causes a rift or a glitch, which represents an unexpected opportunity to explore the unproven. The Astrolabe, an astronomical navigational device, was once used in a mundane way as the modern clock, then becomes instrumental to an unprecedented seismic and temporal event. The Astrolabe is prone to error and misreadings. Specifically, the Astrolabe that we use is a classical panispheric astrolabe, which originates in North Africa. And it's merely an instrument of estimation or approximation, never guaranteeing the absolute. So rather than being alarmed by its possibility of error, estimation suggests an opening for playful interrogation. A handheld model of the universe, the Astrolabe allows for world building and orientation around the self. Therefore, our methodology is to appropriate this instrument as a base for a fictional intervention. The fun really is in the approximation. This device, then, to us, is not merely an instrument of measure, but a device for intervention, disruption, and a map or blueprint for our emergent fictional cosmology, the universe in your palm. We start then by layering human and geologic timescapes. In our storyline, humans become active agents in geologic motions.
So chaos and cosmology and cosmopolitanism as well all recur throughout your text. And I was hoping that you could kind of tease out how these disparate concepts relate to the type of Afrofuturism that you're constructing as well.
Yeah. So our expanded futurism and cosmological fictions form a sort of situated African futurism, one that not only centers African identities over Western worldviews, but also serves to reorient ourselves and escape planetary pessimism. Its purpose is to imagine a world where the people in the Horn of Africa have agency, not bound by violent cartographies, capitalist laws, and estrangement from their land and seas. So as we're writing the story, we want to imagine ourselves to be alive in our rejection of normative and pre-conceptualized global realities. The point is not to erase or revise human history, but rather to reassert belonging and approximate realities through fiction. In this manner, then, we are exerting temporal boundaries. If our imagination is limited to work within the parameters of colonial conditions, how far can we stretch to discover new ways of being? Why really stay within the realms of the believable? There's something, that John Berger said where, and I quote him, "The first step towards building an alternative world has to be a refusal of the world picture implanted in our minds. In the culture of globalization, as in hell, there's no glimpse of an elsewhere or an otherwise. The given is a prison." So for us then, destruction becomes a generative function. It creates a space where new cosmologies can be asserted or formed, forming pathways, wormholes into chaos and the unknown. And so by manipulating the temporal passages, we interrupt the inevitable. We interrupt the inevitable projected doomsday futures that we often see, especially particularly projected onto Africa. We are no longer passive bystanders to our own destinies, no longer written to be abject prisoners and to prepositions. World building evolves into our analytical instrument. Our fictional worlds are testing grounds to examine the absurd, to divert trajectories, and to cultivate multiplicities. We are choosing to synthesize worlds foregrounded in existing cosmologies. The world we're building then, leaks out of its fictional containment and demands to be actualized. Our unforetold potentialities then can thus be, realized in these really absurd, indeterminate spaces.
So how would we be able to cross over into this world that we've just described? And one term that we've both been kind of obsessed with is Chaoskampf, which is this German term defined as the struggle against primordial chaos, the violent clash that is said to have taken place between dual forces or dual massive forces from which the cosmos were born. And so this generative violence that created the universe. And it is such a human trait to keep resisting chaos or to keep warding chaos off through rationality and centralizing knowledge and crafting myths to ward off the profane and incomprehensible. And even in antiquity, we considered the cosmos as a celestial sphere that enveloped the stationary Earth and revolved around us. The Earth, in this case, was still and central, and man was the protagonist, and the planets and the stars were in our orbit. And it's such a human folly that even upon discovering that we were in fact the smaller planet in orbit of the sun or in other planets, in such an unfathomably vast universe, we still maintain this idea that we have dominion over this Earth and perhaps others. So the Astrolabe is not only our direct metaphor for this absurd schism, but it's also an exact visual representation of the reality that was described in antiquity. It's the classical orthographic projection of that celestial sphere onto a device. So we purposely introduced chaos into the system using the Astrolabe, which reinforced that system, right? So in order to disrupt that dysfunctional and unsustainable way of being that we've come to know. And there are these multiple agents within our storytelling and our emergent cosmology, and each of them attack and antagonize a different level or different strata of absurdity that we've come to know as normative. And as we intentionally synthesize these worlds or this larger worlds by foregrounding them into existing cosmologies, we also tether and contain them within a space or within a locality.
So these gaps then is like these points of intervention in whether it's in this past, present, future continuum. These gaps then, are useful in our myth making, which involves various points of entry into these timelines, whether they have been interrupted by modernity or have yet to be. These real and imagined temporalities then are crafted alongside what the writer Glissant has called the modernity of world time, what already exists and is projected. And so you have this layering of possibilities where we're not trying to annex reality, but we exist alongside it. We're choosing to synthesize the worlds foregrounded in existing cosmologies. Our emergent cosmology then is a living portal that opens the Horn of Africa to futures and existences where creation is possible, where differences in technological diversity, spatiality, and being are productive because the differences they can exist as they are. There is an opening for cosmopolitan localisms to use their existing polycentric worlds and to build from there. The world we're building then leaks out of its fictional containment and demands to be actualized. We are seeking a departure into indeterminate spaces and entering the impossible, essentially a cosmological interruption, ultimately building worlds around ourselves rather than inheriting the dysfunction of existing ones.
Okay, sweet, amazing. Yeah, thank you so much. And thank you again for the contribution to the bulletin as well as the short story. I mean, clearly they're both really lovely pieces that generate a lot of really insightful conversation. And I was hoping that we could end with just a little bit of a reading from the short story.
So this is the last thing our sentient Earth says at the end of our short story. Nothing is permanent. The specters of past visitors now haunt my grounds. They serve as ghostly reminders of what I once was, or may have been and have yet to be. Grand arcades, a humble tavern, a landmark, or a patch of earth merely suffering a consistent undoing. Mountains serve as exposed membranes, a series of visible linings felt with bodies, and minuscule beings roam and exhaust their lives in the various interstices of my surface. My remaking is painfully obvious and sublime, a constant hint nudging at all that is. I exist in multiples, dancing in between the thresholds of infancy and ripeness.
The cycle of destruction sees ways everywhere, unconcerned with the vastness of geologic time, let alone futile human urgency. Veils of imagination serve as refuge from the lurking tyrannies of entropy. Yet, destruction is my language, a ritual that is both prescriptive and uncertain, happenings of here and elsewheres. Who could find themselves in my absence? What will you fill with the empty space where I once stood?
Well, Miriam and Nasra, thank you so much. It's been a lovely conversation. And yeah, the story as well as the contribution to the bulletin can both be found on cosmos.art in the bulletin and in the library section of the site as well. So thank you both.
Thank you. Thanks for having us.
Thanks.